All right, so thank you so much. Yeah, I want to thank the work committee for the positive feedback on my work and for giving me the opportunity to present my PhD dissertation today. Thank you for attending this session. We are competing with a big panel at the LLM Special Day. Okay, so once again, my name is Francesco Pierri. I'm an assistant professor at Politecnico di Milano, which is where I received my PhD in data analytics and decision sciences. But I'm originally from the south. I'm from Salerno, near the Amalfi Coast, if you're familiar with the area. But I do currently live in Milano, right? So during my PhD, I was a visiting scholar at Indiana University, working with the Observatory on Social Media with Professor Phil Mengzer. And last summer, I also spent a few months as a visiting postdoc at the USC, working with Professor Emilio Ferrara at the Information Sciences Institute. Yeah, as you may guess, I'm in the computational social science business with a strong focus on understanding the spread of online misinformation and its impact on the real world. But I've also been working a bit on studying human mobility in order to understand the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. Yeah, I'd like to show this to break the ice. I'm a capoeira enthusiast, and this is to show how I can run away from trouble very fast. All right, so just to give you an idea of the original research plan, when I started my PhD, I intended to build my dissertation around three pillars. First one, characterization of misinformation or disinformation. I will use these terms interchangeably, and I will explain it in a bit. The second pillar being detection, so building tools to automatically detect online misinformation. And the third one would have been studying mitigation approaches to alleviate this problem, right? But wasn't able to produce any contribution in that direction, so there's still some work to do, and yeah, stay tuned for that. All right, let's start with a bit of background. I'm sure you're all familiar with these terms, disinformation, misinformation, clickbait, propaganda, and most importantly, fake news. So they tend to be used very differently from researchers in the community. So there's no like a consensus of what a precise definition of the problem is. I like to show this diagram by Claire Wardle and colleagues from a few years back, where they show how misinformation and disinformation are both about false information, right? With the first one being unintentionally shared, and the second one being shared in a deliberate manner, right? So for the sake of this talk, I will kind of use them interchangeably, as I said before. And there's also a caveat, like in the title of my dissertation, I use disinformation. I may have used misinformation. I don't really know right now why I opted for disinformation. So let's say we're dealing with online information disorders, right? And usually when we talk about misinformation, we talk about social media, right? Because they facilitate the spread of false and fabricated content that can be harmful. That's one reason is that because there's no quality control on what is shared on social media platforms, although there is some moderation at play, right? But they cannot check manually everything. Research has also highlighted the role of so-called echo chambers, which facilitate the spread of false information, but also the presence of so-called social bots, fake accounts or trolls. There are also some very human factors at play. The most popular one is confirmation bias. These biases make us prone and vulnerable to believe in false information. And finally, last but not least, you cannot easily suggest potential intervention without raising censorship concerns, right? There are also some more recent concerns in the area. First of all, social media platforms have been restricting more and more access to relevant data for researchers. And this is most likely due to the advent of new generative AI tools, right? And these tools can also pose an additional threat because they can be used to generate disinformation campaigns in a scalable way, right? And at the same time, we're witnessing like a decreasing trend in moderation efforts by platforms. They are firing people working on, cyber social threats, and that's worrying. And there's also a let's say, another concern that I've recently became aware of is that some political actors in the US are targeting researchers that study disinformation. And that's because of the links that have been uncovered in the past between individuals from a specific side of the political spectrum and the tendency to share false news. Okay, I will start describing some of the results from my PhD dissertation. So when I started my PhD, I noticed that most of the research was focusing on the United States, right? And that was because of the 2016 US elections, Donald Trump, fake news, and so on and so forth. So I tried to shift a bit the focus in my own country, right? So I studied the spread of disinformation in the Italian language. This work was published in the PLOS ONE journal. What we did was to replicate some analysis from other studies that had been applied in the United States and run a few extra analyses, right? And what we did was simply to monitor the spread of low credibility news sources on Twitter. And what we found was that misinformation was focusing on controversial topics, being spread by the far-right community and in a very limited volume. And all these findings align with what was found in the United States, for instance. Anyway, so I kind of like using network science approaches. So what we did was to study networks of interactions between users. So here you see a concise view of the network of interactions between Twitter users. And this is the K-core, so let's say most central users in the network. And different colors represent different communities. And we found that most of the communities had strong ties with the far right and the right-wing political spectrum. On the right, you see a network of websites. So what we did was to simply look at hyperlinks in news websites, and we found that Italian misinformation websites were hyperlinking to other disinformation websites from Europe, the US, and Russia. So in many cases, they were even translating stories from a country in Italian. So we couldn't prove actual coordination, but it was interesting. So as you may guess, as I said, I really like networks, and we pushed a bit in that direction, and what we did was to build a methodology to automatically classify disinformation versus mainstream news as a proxy for reliable versus unreliable information. This work was published in scientific reports, and what we did was to collect thousands of news articles shared on Twitter. We would build diffusion networks of interactions between users sharing these news articles, and then we would compare these networks with different techniques, and we tried very basic off-the-shelf machine learning classifiers, and we obtained very accurate results, as I will show in next few slides. The intuition for using networks came from a few studies that had been published in the past. So you may have seen there's a famous science paper mentioning how false and true news spread differently, but also how social bots and coordinated groups might be pushing false narratives. So we thought that they might be shaping sharing patterns differently. And this methodology, in principle, is content and language agnostic, right? And it is also somehow robust to adversarial attacks because it's very hard to manipulate a Twitter network of users on a very large scale. At least this was our intuition, which is hard to prove anyway. So we obtained very accurate results. This is a binary classification framework, and the results were especially accurate for larger networks. And one of our approaches consisted in embedding these Twitter diffusion networks with a vector of topological features, which could be interpreted. And we found results which were aligned with previous literature. For instance, that this information tend to be shared in a more clustered fashion, and that mainstream news are shared in a more broadcast fashion, right, with star-like topologies. We eventually extended this, let's say, single-layer approach with a multi-layer approach, where we disentangle different Twitter actions. So we would build a multi-layer network for each news, and we would try to classify these news items. And this work was later published in EPJ Data Science. Then the COVID-19 pandemic came, and I studied the so-called infodemic, which, according to WHO, is an overload of information during a global disease outbreak. And I worked in collaboration with the Indiana University, and we published a paper in Big Data and Society journal where we compared the spread of misinformation on Facebook and Twitter, tracking over 600 misinformation websites. I'm really squeezing the results here. Let's say the most relevant finding was the evidence of so-called infodemic superspreaders. So what we observed is that there were some influential accounts, in many cases verified by the platforms. Not yet, don't think about the actual Twitter verification status, but let's say the old verified status. And we noticed that they were responsible for a disproportionate amount of reshares. So you may recall the famous Disinformation dozen report. We found something like that, so that these accounts had hundreds of thousands or millions of followers, and they were pushing a few misinformation stories, and they would be reshared by a large amount of users. We kept studying the infodemic by focusing on the potential impact of vaccine misinformation following the introduction of vaccines. So we built two dashboards to show the spread of vaccine-related misinformation in the US and in Italy on Twitter. We were interested in understanding the role of online misinformation in pushing or promoting vaccine hesitancy sentiment in the population. We combined a large-scale data set from the CDC official statistics, Facebook survey data, and Twitter data. We ran a multiple linear regression model, and we found that online misinformation is negatively associated with the amount of vaccine doses that were administered in the US states, and positively associated with vaccine hesitancy in states and counties. So here you see a strong correlation between political leaning and vaccine hesitancy. By means of a multiple linear regression model, we found that online misinformation shared on Twitter was weakly but significant associated with the vaccine variables. So on the left, you see at the state level. On the right, you see the correlational effect at the county level. And one interesting result is that apparently the effect of online misinformation was stronger in Democratic counties than in Republican counties. And of course, this study is a correlational study, so there's no causation, no causal effects. We try to address that by means of Granger causality analysis and some other group-level analysis. And another strong limitation is that the Twitter population is very different from the actual US population. So there's an overrepresentation, for instance, of Democratic counties. The geolocation tool that we used was not 100% accurate. And finally, there are other demographic biases in Twitter user base. So to sum up the contributions of my thesis, I showed how Italian misinformation was limited to a very restricted communities with strong ties with the far right. I was also able to exploit sharing patterns of news on Twitter to accurately classify disinformation versus mainstream news. I've been studying the COVID-19 infodemic, looking at the role played by a few influential accounts that were dubbed as super spreaders of misinformation. And I also showed how online misinformation might impact vaccination programs. I will just open a short parenthesis on another line of research. So I mentioned that I was working also on human mobility data. And during my PhD, I've also published a study in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where we use mobile phone data from Facebook, and we, by means of a quantitative regression approach, we studied the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown in Italy. And we pinpointed the most affected areas in our country in terms of mobility as a proxy for potential economic loss. And last but not least, I just do a bit of promotion. If you work on similar topics, we have an open call for papers at EPJ Data Science. We are considering submissions until September. Feel free to reach out to me if you have anything to submit. And finally, I want to thank my wonderful team of co-authors and colleagues, my advisor, and also you for your attention. So thank you.